Right. Imagine spending £350 billion, adding 500 quid annually to every household's energy bills, making British industry uncompetitive for the next quarter century, and doing all of this in the name of saving the planet faster than anyone asked you to. Now imagine being told by the actual energy system operator that you could achieve the same environmental goals for significantly less money if you just slowed down a bit and thought things through. That is precisely the situation Ed Miliband finds himself in right now, and Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary, is absolutely eviscerating him for it. She is accusing him of leading Britons up the garden path with promises of cheaper bills while simultaneously implementing policies that will make energy eye-wateringly expensive. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is reportedly giving Miliband a final warning about the political catastrophe his net-zero obsession might unleash. This is what happens when ideology crashes headfirst into economic reality, and honestly, it is glorious to watch. Quick favor, if you are already hooked on this energy policy drama, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Over 94% of you wonderful viewers have not subscribed yet. It is absolutely free, takes 2 seconds, and means the world to us here at British Mirror. Cheers if you did. Now, let us dive into this green policy meltdown. So let us start with a bombshell report that has triggered all of this chaos. The National Energy System Operator, known as NESO, which is basically the organization responsible for making sure Britain's energy grid actually works, has just dropped some analysis that should terrify anyone paying attention to energy policy. According to their calculations, Britain could save £14 billion per year if we dropped the legally binding 2050 net zero target. £14 billion per year. That is not pocket change. That is not rounding errors in government accounting. That is serious money that could transform the economy, fund the NHS properly, fix the potholes, or literally anything else more useful than rushing headlong towards net zero targets that nobody outside Westminster particularly cares about. But wait, it gets better. Always, depending on your perspective. Ed Miliband's current plan to reach net zero could cost £350 billion, more than a slower, more sensible approach. £350 billion. To put that in context, that is more than the entire annual NHS budget. That is the kind of money that could rebuild Britain's infrastructure several times over. And where does that money come from? Well, funny you should ask, because according to the analysis, it adds £500 per year to British households. Every household. Every year. For the next 25 years. That is not a one-off cost. That is a permanent reduction in living standards in the name of hitting arbitrary climate targets slightly faster than we otherwise would. Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary, has seized on this report like a terrier with a particularly juicy bone, and honestly, you can understand why. She told GB News that Labour's net zero policy is making the country poorer and vowed to reverse all net zero legislation. Now, that is quite a statement. Reversing all net zero legislation is not tinkering around the edges. That is not adjusting timelines or reconsidering specific targets. That is a wholesale repudiation of the entire policy framework that has dominated British energy policy for the past several years. It is politically bold, economically defensible based on this analysis, and absolutely guaranteed to send environmentalists into apoplectic rage. Coutinho acknowledged that her party, the Conservatives, have had different views on this over the years, which is the understatement of the century. The Conservatives have flip-flopped on net zero more times than a politician caught in a scandal trying to decide whether to apologize or double down. But she claims that when she became Energy Secretary, the first thing she did was start a net zero reset because the party was not being honest about the costs. Which is refreshingly candid. Actually, most politicians would never admit their party has been misleading people. They would use phrases like evolving position or responding to new information. But Coutinho just straight up said, we were not being honest, which is either brutal honesty or brilliant politics, possibly both. The core of her argument is that the NESO report shows, for the first time really clearly, that a rushed pathway to net zero adds enormous costs to the energy system. £350 billion is their middle scenario, which is terrifying because that means there are scenarios where it costs even more. She points out that this £500 annual hit to households is equivalent to 0.4% of GDP, and it means Britain will have uncompetitive energy prices for the next 25 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 25 years of uncompetitive energy prices. That is a generation of British businesses struggling to compete with countries that did not saddle themselves with insane energy costs. That is a generation of British families choosing between heating and eating because electricity is absurdly expensive. That is economic self-harm on a national scale. Coutinho argues that this is why she and Keir Starmer have changed the Conservative Party's position on net zero. They looked at the costs, did the maths, and realized that Britain cannot afford to deindustrialize itself in pursuit of climate targets that will make negligible difference to global emissions anyway. She specifically mentions the growth of artificial intelligence as an example, noting that AI requires enormous amounts of energy, and if Britain makes energy prohibitively expensive, all that growth and all those jobs will simply go elsewhere. Countries with cheap, reliable energy will attract the investment and reap the economic benefits, whilst Britain virtue signals itself into poverty. Then Coutinho absolutely goes for the jugular with a point that is so devastatingly obvious you wonder why nobody has hammered it home before. She points out that if you want to move the country towards electrification, getting people to switch to electric heating and electric cars, doing so while simultaneously making electricity incredibly expensive is completely counterproductive. It is like opening a gym and filling it with broken equipment. It is like starting a restaurant and serving terrible food. You are trying to encourage behavior whilst making that behavior economically punishing. Nobody is going to voluntarily switch to an electric car if charging it costs more than filling a petrol tank. Nobody is going to install a heat pump if it sends their energy bills through the roof. The policy objectives are pulling in completely opposite directions. And this is where Ed Miliband's promises come back to haunt him. During the election campaign, Labour promised to cut people's energy bills by £300. £300. That was a specific, clear, unambiguous promise. Vote Labour. Save money on energy. Except now we have official analysis showing that Labour's net zero plans will actually add £500 per year to household bills. So instead of saving £300, people are going to be paying £500 more. That is an £800 swing in the wrong direction. That is not a broken promise. That is the exact opposite of what was promised. Coutinho accuses Miliband of leading people up the garden path, which is delightfully British understatement for lying through his teeth about the costs. She demands that Miliband do a true costing of his plans so people can really see what Labour's policies mean for their bills, which is reasonable, except Miliband absolutely will not do that because a true costing will be political suicide. The moment Labour publishes official figures showing their green policies will dramatically increase energy costs, their entire electoral coalition falls apart. Working-class voters in the north who switched to Labour because they were promised better living standards will feel betrayed. Middle-class voters in the suburbs who are already struggling with cost of living will revolt. Even committed environmentalists might question whether these specific policies are worth the economic damage. Now, here's where things get properly interesting, because the conversation then pivots to Labour's recent appointment of 25 new peers in the House of Lords. You might be wondering what that has to do with energy policy, and the answer is absolutely nothing directly, but everything indirectly. Coutinho questions why the government is struggling with the Lords so early on into their tenure, and she has a point. Labour has a massive majority in the Commons. They should be able to pass basically anything they want through the elected chamber. So why are they having so much trouble in the Lords that they need to appoint 25 new peers to stack the upper chamber in their favour? Coutinho's answer is fascinating. She argues that Labour has brought forward legislation that is incredibly controversial and that they simply did not tell people about at the election. She specifically mentions assisted dying, decriminalization of abortion right up to full term, and lifting the two-child benefit cap. These are massive, society-altering policy changes that were not prominently featured in Labour's manifesto. They were not debated during the campaign. Voters were not asked for their opinion. And now they are being pushed through Parliament despite significant opposition, including from within Labour's own ranks and from the Lords. Coutinho argues that rather than stuffing the Lord with friendly peers who will rubber-stamp controversial legislation, Starmer should ask himself why people are so worried about his programme for government. Why are policies facing such resistance? Could it possibly be because they were not properly debated, not included in the manifesto, and not what voters thought they were getting when they elected a Labour government? It is a devastating line of attack because it goes beyond specific policies and questions the entire legitimacy of Labour's legislative agenda. The host, Stephen Dixon, pushes back by noting that appointing peers is not unusual and every government does it, which is true. But Coutinho counters by pointing out that the scale and timing matter. Labour is not making routine appointments to maintain balance. They are packing the Lords specifically to overcome opposition to controversial legislation. It is a difference between normal personnel management and stacking the deck because you know your hand is weak. The assisted dying legislation she mentions is particularly relevant here because it has been incredibly divisive, even within Labour. Many MPs had serious moral and ethical concerns about rushing through such profound legislation without proper scrutiny. The fact that Labour is having to pack the Lords to get these policies through suggests they know the legislation cannot survive proper scrutiny, so they are removing that scrutiny by ensuring friendly votes. But let us bring this back to Ed Miliband and net zero, because that is where the real political danger lies for Labour. Energy policy affects everyone. Every household, every business, every aspect of the economy depends on reliable, affordable energy. If Labour's green agenda leads to higher bills and economic stagnation, voters will notice. You cannot hide rising energy costs.